My name is Jason Del Gandio. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication and Social Influence at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia, PA, which is over in the United States of America. I want to thank all of the conference organizers, all the presenters. I've had a really good time yesterday and today. And I'm really appreciative of being here and being able to present my ideas and my work. So the title of my presentation is the EDM Vibe More Than Affect. And so here are the basic questions that I'm trying to address during my presentation. So first and foremost, how do EDM scholars theorize the vibe? In other words, how do they talk about the vibe? How do they think about the vibe? And how do they present ideas about the vibe in their scholarship? In reviewing the literature of EDM scholarship and talking about the vibe, a lot of people seem to talk about the vibe in terms of affect or affectivity. In other words, the vibe is another word for affect. When I say affect or affectivity, in other words, how bodies affect other bodies, how bodies relate to other bodies, how bodies influence other bodies. One of the ways this is sometimes addressed is through, quote unquote, a social aesthetic relationship. In other words, when you're on the dance floor and you have the sound and the music and bodies are rubbing against each other, it's a social aesthetic relationship that's being generated. I am in full support of affect theory. I'm in full support of the notion of socio-aesthetics. I have nothing against that. But when we view the vibe through this lens, then the question becomes, well, is there anything actually left of the vibe itself? In other words, is the vibe an actual phenomenon in its own right? So vibe is short for vibration, and how do we understand vibrations? And so from there, the question becomes, how might EDM scholars expand their approach to theorizing about the vibe in a way that doesn't reduce or restrict the vibe to affect? So a few bullet points about me first before moving on. I went to my first rave in 1992, so quite a long time ago. And then I went on to clubs and festivals, all that kind of stuff. And those early experiences, though, really shaped my own personal development, but also my intellectual development. So I went to my first rave in 92, but then went to graduate school in 1997 and eventually finished up in grad school in 2002. And actually, I wrote my dissertation on the vibe itself. And to clarify that, I didn't write my dissertation on the rave scene or rave culture or EDM scholarship. Rather, I tried to develop a theory and a philosophy of the vibe, which I refer to as bodily emanation. In other words, the human body, emanates or radiates an actual felt energy out into the world that other people can experience and that you can exchange vibes with people. Now, while I was in grad school, towards the end of my grad career, I got involved with activism and social movements, and that kind of set me off on a different kind of career path. So literally for the next 20 years, my intellectual life was dedicated to radical social change, to activism, social justice, things like that. And because of that, I didn't have a lot of time to spend on the vibe itself. I would come back to the project every once in a while, but nothing in great detail. Within a couple of years ago, I decided to go back to the vibe, and really I've been dedicating my time full time to the vibe for the past couple of years. And in that process is when I stumbled across EDM scholarship. So despite my experiences and my interests, I just really wasn't involved in EDM scholarship, unfortunately. But then I was writing an essay a couple of years ago, trying to figure out how other scholars are talking about the vibe, and I came across the work that you guys are all doing. And I want to give a particular shout out to the work of Graham St. John, who I'm sure you all probably know. He was one of the first EDM scholars I came across and writes about the vibe. And I'm just want to say thank you, Graham, if you're here, for the work that you do, and I really appreciate it. Okay, now back to the vibe itself. So expanding the conversation. The first question I have in mind about this topic is whether or not the vibe is a metaphor or is it ontological? In other words, is the vibe a word for something else? It's not a real thing on its own. Or is the vibe its own ontological phenomenon that we can think about, theorize about, and report upon? So first, vibe is metaphor. I think this is fairly easy to understand. So like I said earlier, it's not uncommon for scholars to talk about the vibe in terms of affectivity, how bodies affect other bodies. But then even outside of scholarship, if you analyze popular culture, if you analyze public discourse, it is very common to hear people talk about the vibe all the time. Everything from musicians and poets to new age gurus to sports announcers, etc. But very rarely do you hear someone put forward a concrete definition of the vibe. And instead, it's really a catchphrase for something else. You might refer to emotion, to feeling, mood, atmosphere, etc., etc., etc. But now, what about the vibe as an ontological phenomenon? Right? So if we say that the vibe is a real thing, in other words, it has its own ontological status in the world, and it's part of human experience, the first question becomes, what is the nature of the vibe? In other words, is it a physical phenomenon? Is it a metaphysical phenomenon? Is it perhaps both physical and metaphysical? Or perhaps it is something else altogether? So first, I'll talk about the vibe as a physical phenomenon, right? And these are just ways of possibly understanding the vibe. So first, with quantum physics, and I'm not a physicist, but as far as I know, with quantum physics, you have subatomic particles that make up atoms, and then you have atoms that are the building blocks of the physical universe. And both subatomic particles and atoms actually vibrate, and they vibrate at different frequencies. And those different frequencies formulate different molecules, which makes up the physical universe. And the important part here, though, is that at some level and in some way, the entire physical universe, including the human body, is actually vibrating all the time. Then we have things like light and sound. So as far as I know, you have light particles or light waves. They bounce off of objects. They move through space, hit our eyes, and then as they hit our retinas, they send electrical impulses to our brains, and that's how we process the experience of light. And then sound is similar. You take two objects or two forces, they come into contact with each other. That contact creates a vibration, and that vibration then produces a physical energy that moves through space, enters our ears, it then vibrates the air in our ears, and again, electrical impulses are sent from our ears to our brains to process sound. Then we have something like electromagnetic energy. So again, electromagnetic energy. And here I would refer you to what's referred to as the Heart Math Institute. The Heart Math Institute is a nonprofit organization that studies the bioenergetic nature of the human heart. And they argue that the heart, the human heart, generates electromagnetic fields that permeate every cell of the human body. Additionally, they argue, or the research shows, that that electromagnetic energy can be measured and detected up to several feet beyond the human body, which is to say that the body itself does generate actual energy that can be felt and experienced by other people. Okay, so that was the vibe as a physical phenomenon. And now we're about the vibe as possibly a metaphysical phenomenon. I'm going to assume that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with this to some degree, right? It's the basic idea that you have the physical universe, but there's something that is more primordial than the physical universe. A primordial energy or some kind of original source that is the source of everything that exists. And when we talk about it in this way, we're talking about mystical insight, mystical experience, etc. Now here, there's a certain kind of tension between Western scholarship and the EDM experience. So for non-scholar EDM fans, most of those fans will talk about the vibe in terms of cosmic energy, some life force, a spiritual experience, etc., etc., etc. But with Western-oriented scholarship, most Western-oriented scholars shy away from these philosophies, these traditions, and these terms. And in doing so, we lose the ability to theorize about the vibe through this lens. Now, having said that, it's a bit strange, though, because interest in energy systems and interest in ideas or experiences related to the vibe are of global and cross-cultural interest. In other words, from time immemorial, humans throughout the entire globe have been talking about these kinds of experiences. The obvious examples would be something like shamanism, Eastern spirituality, and indigenous cosmologies. But then the question still arises, well, is the vibe a physical phenomenon or a metaphysical phenomenon? And I want to pose a series of questions to try to break up this binary thinking here. Right? So for instance, is it possible that the vibe is both physical and metaphysical? Is it perhaps possible that the vibe is neither physical nor metaphysical? And then going even further, is it possible that the vibe is actually all these things and then some? Now, with this last question, it's a bit strange and it's hard to comprehend. What I'm trying to do is kind of explode all of the paradigms. Rather than forcing people to choose one paradigm over another paradigm, let's put all the paradigms on the table, shuffle through them, and kind of generate more dialogue, generate more discussion about the nature of the vibe. Rather than restricting ourselves, let's kind of explode it all and have a profound and interesting conversation about the nature of the vibe. And then just quickly here about my own theory about the vibes, like I said earlier with my dissertation and stuff I've been doing since then. So I refer to the vibe, or I rethink the vibe in terms of bodily emanation. And the idea is that the human body actually radiates or emanates a tangible felt energy that perpetually radiates out into the world. Now, a lot of times the vibe is talked about in terms of ecstatic experience. So it's 4 a.m, we're on the dance floor, everything's going great, and the vibe is there, you're in it, you feel it, right? And that's an ecstatic experience. But I argue that the vibe, it doesn't just appear during ecstatic experience, but rather it is a ongoing, perpetual aspect of human experience, period. It's there all the time. And in those ecstatic experiences, though, it's when we become more aware of it. And I offer up this theory or philosophy as a heuristic. In other words, I'm not positing it as an absolute truth, but rather as a way to understand this thing that we call the vibe. And I also suspend judgment in terms of whether it is real or not real. So, for instance, we all talk about the vibe and we experience this thing we call the vibe. So how might we theorize about this thing we call the vibe and this experience that we collectively have? And then I break it down in terms of different levels and modes. So I argue that the vibe occurs during interpersonal relationships. So you and a friend are having a conversation and you can feel the vibe between each other. It occurs on small and large group levels, such as a club, a festival, a protest or march, at a church or a synagogue, in a classroom, at a sporting event, etc. Then we can talk about local and regional vibes. So the vibe of New York City versus the vibe of London versus the vibe of Lisbon, Portugal, or of Tokyo, etc. And in some kind of way, we have cultural vibes. So the vibe of America versus the vibe of Canada versus that of France or Spain, and so on. And then I also argue that there's a global vibe. This is more abstract, but the way that I break it down is that each and every human body generates a vibe, and there are human bodies all across the planet. Therefore, there must be a global vibe. And then from there, though, we can think about the vibe in terms of different modes of experience. So the vibe is not just some kind of fleeting experience, but rather we can use it as a form of communication. So how do you use the vibe to actually communicate with other people? And then from there, we think about the vibe in terms of a way of knowing. In other words, what kind of epistemology is generated by looking at the world through bodily emanation, looking at the world through the vibe. And then if you become more trained at attuning yourself to the vibe, then the vibe can also become an existential guide for moving through the world. In other words, the vibe will push and pull you, it will attract you to and also detract you from certain people, certain places, certain events, certain experiences, etc. And then we can even go further with this, and it's obviously much more difficult to theorize and stuff, but what about the possibility of a universal vibe? Right? And what I'm trying to do here when I pose this question is to have us think beyond the human experience and the human condition. Right? So if human beings give off a vibe, then why not other animate organic creatures, such as animals, insects, microscopic living organisms, trees, plants, even blades of grass. And we have things like the earth itself, the moon, sun, stars, the oceans, etc., etc., etc. Now, the benefits of seeing the world through this lens is that it helps us move away from a Western paradigm, which has all kinds of problems built into it. Right? And it also decenters the human experience. So rather than accounting just for human experience, how do we account for other kinds of experiences that are outside of the human condition? And that is the end of my formal presentation. Thank you again all for listening and being here. A few quick notes here. If you want sources about the vibe, just email me and I can send you source things I've been reading lately. If you have written about the vibe, please contact me. I would love to read your work. Even if you disagree with me, that's totally fine. I just would like to see how you're theorizing about the vibe. And one small note here, most of the images that you found that are used in my PowerPoint, I just found online. So I'm trying to avoid copyright infringement issues. So they're just there for a visual effect. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen and take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Great. Do we have any questions in the chat? All right, we do. I have a question from Hildegonda Rietveld. Maybe I can read this aloud. Jason, do you see these questions in the chat in case you want to refer to them yourself?
Yes, if you want to read.
Actually, I'm sorry. We have even earlier ones. From Bernardo Atias. Maybe the easiest way to do this, since we have several, would be for you to select one of these questions from the chat, and then we can go to our other panelists. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's just take a quick second to peruse.
So I know Ben. Hi Ben, how are you doing? I can't see you obviously, but Ben and I actually are in the same field of communication studies. So Ben, no, I've looked at classic Greek work and ecstatic states, not necessarily. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'll definitely. I have not looked at that, but I'll definitely look it up. So that sounds awesome. Zoe asks the origins of the vibe. Have you considered Caribbean sound system culture, and then its appropriation into EDMC? I have not, but I will definitely look into it. Like I said earlier in my presentation, I'm open to reading anything about the vibe. So if you have sources for it or even secondary sources, I'm happy to look at that.
Actually, just on that note, very quickly, Graham St. John makes this connection in Technomad between the vibe and sound system cultures. So he's, I feel like if you read enough of his books, you're going to find him talking.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of his stuff. Yeah, not everything. Yeah, I've read a lot of his stuff. Yeah,
but that is he does etymologize vibe.
Okay. So
it's one argument for sure.
I wonder about the cultural etymology of the word concept.
And then I'm thinking, let's do maybe like 6 minutes for questions. Is that okay? And then we can push on.
Yeah.
Great.
So one of the questions about the etymology of the word concept of the vibe, and again, like Tommy said, I do know that Graham St. John has an article, maybe Media Freaks or something like that, Exile Freaks. There's a couple paragraphs in there about how the word vibe or vibration migrated into American culture, particularly American subcultures. Now, having said that, though, there's the word vibe itself in terms of the English spelling of it, right? But then there's also the phenomenon that presumably most cultures have talked about in some kind of way, right? It'd be interesting to see how that translates across languages and across cultures and time periods. And then how might that linguistic lens either highlight certain aspects of this thing we're talking about, or then delimit certain aspects of this thing that we're talking about. In other words, is it a direct correlation and translation between cultures and languages? And that I don't know. One of the images that was in my PowerPoint was on the bio points. It was me standing in front of street graffiti and some vibes. And that picture was actually taken in Lisbon, Portugal. So I was over in Lisbon, Portugal a couple years ago, just on vacation, traveling, and I saw that image there. And so the word vibe, though, does make its way around the world in different kind of contexts, which is interesting in itself. Okay. Other questions or comments?
Jasmine or Tiago, would you guys like to comment at all?
Sure, I'll hop in here. It was interesting that you noted the tension between Western scholarship and this notion of the vibe. And I'm just wondering, have you explored tensions or relationships between Eastern cultures and Eastern-based philosophies, scholarship, and just their notions of the vibe and time and space?
Not in terms of scholarship per se, but in terms of So, for instance, I just recently read Tao Te Ching, right? The Book of the Way, and so this is a classic text from the East, and they don't use the word vibe, but they're obviously referencing some kind of energy, primordial source, things like that. And so, in terms of classic texts around the world, you'll find references to this kind of phenomenon. I'm not sure about actual contemporary scholarship. That would be interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, I just think about it because like in the music realm, I know even people who study classical music, when they study let's say Eastern styles of classical music. Uh-oh. Oh, okay. They'll note that there's just a different sense of time and space that you have to think through with that framework too. So.
Right. With that question, I can't answer this right now, but it'd be interesting to see how the Enlightenment era within Western culture has affected our ability or desire to talk about metaphysics in scholarship within the Western context, but to see if that has also a colonizing effect on scholarship around the world as well. Anything else?
Tiago, would you like to speak at all? Are you all set? Okay, I have one quick question. Jason, is it all right if I have a quick question? And full disclosure, I'm a religious studies person.
Oh.
So also I have some over here. And one thing I kind of like felt your presentation doing that I like as a rhetorical effect, but also as maybe pointing to something maybe besides that, is you started with a question of like, as I kind of heard you saying it, it was like, is the vibe real? Like, is it material or metaphor? Maybe it's both, but like, we have to like maybe take it easy. Like, let's just suggest it for a second. And then by the end of your presentation, I definitely got the feeling that you had left that question far behind, and you're kind of delving into not necessarily like, what is the nature of the vibe? Is it metaphysical? Your question is flipped and it's become like, what is the nature of the universe? Is it vibrating? Which is a sweet question. And like one that I think we can all feel and sympathize with. But in terms of like not letting the question of the vibe turn into the question of universal metaphysics, I think is one key to like holding on to something that is pretty real for a lot of people, and it is a lot of different things, I think. But I guess, so the one way I would pose this question is like, what is not the vibe? That is an expression too. And when do people say that? And does that mean that we've ceased emanating vibrations, or maybe we're emanating very particular ones?
Right.
Anyway, I love all these questions too, and yeah.
No, so everything you said is correct in terms of analyzing my rhetorical choices. Yes, that is all true, right? But in terms of your last question there, like, what is not the vibe? Well, I also want to be like, I am an intellectual. Like, I want to go slow here in terms of analyzing what is and was not the vibe here, right? I want to say everything's just the vibe. So, for instance, according to quantum physics, everything is vibrating.
Totally.
There's a gap, though, between saying everything's vibrating and then that's what we're actually experiencing.
Right. If everything is vibrating and I'm vibrating and the air is vibrating and the light is vibrating and the noise is vibrating, why can I feel it only in certain moments or something like that?
And so, I mean, also I'm trying to partially distance myself from, let's say, particular New Age theories that are just like intellectually lacking in rigor. Right? Like, I'm not essentially against them, but like, I think, I take it as a responsibility to use my intellectual abilities to think through these questions as opposed to just positing it because I'm some young hippie kid. Like, that's so again, I think there's a big intellectual gap between saying that everything is physically vibrating and saying that is what the vibe is. Like, I'm not sure.
Or maybe maybe that gap is the one that you're really trying to dive into.
Sure. No doubt about it. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.